Okay, so I guess welcome everybody to the course. It's my first time doing a sort of online seminar thing, so I'm not quite sure how it'll all go, but I guess we'll learn as we go along. What I sort of want to talk about in this course is basically ongoing research for my next book. So I'm trying to sort of work through some ideas here, test them out, just see whether some distinctions and some ideas make sense, and hopefully learn from everyone here as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now the course is going to be on the sort of changing material conditions of capitalism, and the belief sort of that we're seeing a new transformation of the means of production, and that our task should be to analyze these changes and strategize over how to make use of them. So how do we make use of these different technologies that are emerging, new means of production, in order to use them for a leftist project? Now, if you look historically, any sort of change in the means of production, it means both a decrease in the traditional methods of struggle and an increase in new methods. So to give a very simple example, the fact that a point of production was a major site for workplace struggles in the early 20th century, but with the rise of the logistics revolution, with the rise of globalization, suddenly these point of production struggles are no longer as useful, no longer as powerful. So you have a switch to, more recently, sort of struggles around circulation. But the idea here is that every single change in the means of production changes also the forms of struggle that emerge around it. So what I want to look at in this course is what do the sort of emerging changes in the means of production, what do they mean for two things? One, political struggle. So where is the actual location of struggle nowadays? What's the sort of most potent areas for struggle? But also, two, what are the sort of post-capitalist potentials that are emerging with these new technologies? So how are they actually making possible something like a post-capitalist world in spite of a sort of capitalist determination of technology? So I guess that's going to be the broad overview of the course. What I'd like to do now, if it's possible, is sort of have everybody introduce themselves so we all know each other's name, and then just say, A, where you're from, so I know if it's the middle of the night for you or not, and two, also, what are sort of your intellectual interests, and then maybe I can sort of tailor the course around people's intellectual interest as well. So I don't know if we can sort of have people one by one introduce themselves at all. If somebody sort of wants to start off. Is everybody's mics on mute, I guess? I don't know if I can... Can people jump in, I guess?
Hi, my name is Thomas Elliott, and I'm from Novi, Michigan, and I guess I'm broadly Heideggerian thinker, and I don't know, I studied with Badiou over the last year, and yeah, contemporary critical theory is basically my major thing, other than Heidegger and German idealism more broadly.
Okay, excellent. Anybody else want to go ahead?
Hey everyone, I'm Jose. I'm a doctoral student at Stony Brook University in the philosophy program, and my research interests are mostly centered around post-World War II French philosophy, Marxism, and political philosophy.
Okay, great. Anybody else want to introduce themselves?
Yeah, we have the, this is the Grand Rapids group. You want to go?
Yeah, hi, I'm Alex, and I'm from Grand Rapids, and my interests are in continental philosophy.
Hi, I'm Colleen. I'm from Midland, Michigan, and
As for philosophical interests, this is all new to me, but my main interest as a graduate student in social work is neuropsychology and the aging population.
Hi, I'm Matthew Wynn, and most of my work has been around writing centers and writing center theory and Marx.
Okay, great. Anybody else want to introduce themselves?
Sure.
Thomas, do you want to go?
Hold on.
Or somebody else was just about to go.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Aaron. I'm coming to you from New York. My background is in intellectual history and German, and interest in political philosophy, collective and individual notions of agency, and sort of that kind of broad stuff.
Okay, perfect. So we've got a lot of Americans so far, it seems like. Anybody else?
Okay. I'm Olivia. I'm based out of LA right now. Yeah, and I studied politics and sculpture in school, so just generally interested in the intersection of technology and art, specifically new media work. So, yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Anybody else?
Hey everybody, can you hear me?
I can hear somebody in the background there.
Okay, so my name is Samuel. I was born in Venezuela. Now I'm based in Miami. And my background's in science and technology studies. So I'm interested in the relation between technology and capitalism capitalism and ontology, questions of ontology and epistemology when it comes to technology.
Okay, great. Anybody else? I see a few other people who haven't spoken up yet.
Bradley, do you want to go?
Hi, yeah. Hi. Am I up there?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm in Buffalo, New York. I actually did graduate work in the PIC program out of Binghamton University. And so I've been working on critical theory for 7, 8, maybe 10 years now. And I'm very interested in Marx and technology and how it relates to critiques of capitalism.
Okay.
And resistance. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? I think we've got a handful of people left over now who haven't spoken up yet.
Maybe Tracy?
Pressure.
Sorry.
Okay. Hi, I'm Tracy. I'm out of Vancouver, Canada. Just that little, backwater on the edge of the continent. I'm a practicing artist, a busy traveler. I'm interested in social and economic theories and the end of capitalism, or the next modernism, so to speak. But generally everything everyone else here is interested in, just in a new kind of way. It's my first time here for this class, so yeah,
okay.
Hi.
Good. I think that seems to be most people. What I want to do at some point is, in the next 3 weeks, what we'll do is we'll have 2 students per each reading. So there's 3 readings per week. We'll have 2 students per each reading. One is essentially going to start off the class by presenting on the reading, and the other one is then going to critique the presentation. So not necessarily the work itself, the reading, but the presentation of the reading. Now it seems like it'd be quite confusing to sort of organize this right now. So what I'll do is I'll send around something through group email or a group message, and people can sort of select which readings they want to, and we'll organize something along those lines. And also I'd just like to sort of mention that I very much encourage people to sort of ask questions during while I'm talking and stuff. So if you have something to say, either just butt in and say it, or use the sidebar, which is quite useful as well. So you can sort of type questions in there, and then I'll try to take them as they come at me. Yeah, so any questions to begin with then? Okay. So today's seminar, basically what I want to talk about is the sort of recent debates around repurposing and the ambiguities of technology, and sort of take this from a very sort of a Marxist perspective, and actually in a sort of hardline Marxist perspective where all of technology is determined by capitalism and is determined for capitalist functions. And if we take that as a premise, I don't necessarily agree with it, but if we take that as a premise, how can we think about the repurposing of technology today? So I want to sort of see how repurposing can be understood in relation to more traditional ideas, things like seizing the means of production. So sort of classic Leninist idea of taking over the state and seizing the means of production, but also the situationist idea of détournement. So that's what I'm going to talk about this week. The next 2 weeks then are going to be on two specific technologies, two types of functions that I think are quite useful for a post-capitalist world. And I sort of prefer to talk about functions here rather than technologies, because when you're talking about functions, unless you focus on what is essential in any given technology, without necessarily holding you to the current state of technology. So to give an example, something like economic planning is a particular function of technology, which then gets embodied in different ways. So it can be embodied in input-output models. It can be embodied in complex systems models, all of these sorts of things. So when we talk about economic planning, it can change with the technologies. And two functions I want to look at in particular are going to be flexible production. This is going to mean talking about just-in-time logistics and additive manufacturing or 3D printing. And then I want to talk about decentralized planning. So things like the socialist calculation problem, which emerged in the 1920s and 1930s, but also big data as it emerges today, and then computer modeling of various kinds. So computer modeling not just in sort of Soviet system and the Chilean system, but how also, say for instance, central banks and a place like Walmart, for instance, is using computer modeling today. So that's what I want to talk about in the next 2 weeks. And then the final week is sort of going to be on the space of struggle. So the other ones are going to sort of leave aside the politics of technology. And then the last week I want to focus on where actually struggle occurs in order to bring about these changes. So if we're going to transition to something like a post-capitalist world, where should our energies be focused? Should it be the traditional point of production? Or should it be the point of circulation? Or should it be something else? And I want to sort of look at these technologies to see what potentials they offer for struggle and what this might mean in the future. The question is basically what can be done, and that's what I want to focus on in the last week. So what does post-capitalism mean for me? I've sort of grown fond of the term, largely because it avoids associations with historical movements around communism and socialism. And an index is a more generic sense of something after capitalism. And I think that's important as well. So it's not something before capitalism. It's not a retrogression towards feudalism or primitivism or anything like this, but it's something after capitalism. And I think to give the term some more content, at a minimum, I mean post-capitalism by a world where work is reduced as much as possible, where wage labor is ended, where flexible production responds rapidly and cheaply to individual desires, and where there's collective control over the economy, and where scarcity is eliminated as much as possible. And I think in the last criteria there, you also implicitly have a demand for a turn towards renewable energy. If we're going to have a world of abundance, we need to be able to do these things without destroying the earth. So that's sort of what I mean by post-capitalism. That's sort of the idea I'm going to use throughout the entire course as far as post-capitalism goes. Now, if we're going to be historical materialists about this, we know that modes of production do not shift rapidly. So they are embedded systems with both a physical footprint and a massive social architecture of entrenched interest and systemic imperatives built into them. So to take, the obvious example here, capitalism did not arise all at once. Instead, it emerged from the confluence of a variety of different contingent elements meeting together. And even throwing these elements together is not sufficient to actually bring about capitalism. So I think it's Althusser actually who points out at some point where all these sorts of elements of capitalism were available a couple thousand years ago, but they didn't emerge into capitalism. There's a sort of contingent encounter involved in all of these elements, which does bring about this sort of systemic imperative to accumulate. Now I think this sort of same image of transition, this long-term, slow, piecemeal building up of the conditions, I think that image of transition has to hold for post-capitalism as well. So it's not going to happen all at once through some sort of magical revolution, and it's not going to come about through the mindless destruction of the existing order. So it's instead going to require a concerted effort at building up the conditions necessary for something like a post-capitalist mode of production to eventually come about. And I don't think this is a quick project, and I think we need to be thinking in the timeline of years and decades for it to sort of come to fruition. And if you look at capitalism, it takes, arguably in some accounts, a couple centuries to sort of fully come to fruition. So this is the sort of timelines we need to be thinking. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we can just sort of sit back and be patient. We can still do things in the present moment to build these conditions. So in my Verso book, Alex Williams and I, we've tried to outline a way forward for the first two elements of post-capitalism. So in that book, we largely focus upon the reduction of work and the decommodification of labor. And I should also mention, if people have questions about the book, we can sort of talk about that as well. I'm happy to discuss those issues. But broadly, that book is set out to sort of analyze exactly how would we bring about the reduction of work and the decommodification of labor over the next, say, 2 decades. Now, in this course, and in my next book, I want to examine some of the other elements in order to begin a discussion on the potentials or not. I mean, maybe it'll turn out that actually our built environment isn't built for a post-capitalist world at all. But if it is, how might it be leveraged to begin putting into place the basic conditions for a new economic system? So, in understanding this, I want to sort of frame the ideas of changes in technology as changes in an idea called platforms, which I think is more than just the means of production, and it also gets beyond some of the sort of traditional debates about base and superstructure. So what are platforms? This is an idea that's sort of been tossed around by Benedict Singleton most prominently, but also Benjamin Bratton is working on it. And I think his upcoming book, The Stack, is going to discuss it quite a bit. So I'm trying to sort of work out exactly what are the conceptual parameters of this idea. And it's something I'm hoping to do through the course of this course. So, but to begin with, a quote from Benjamin Bratton here, who I think very nicely sums up at least one image of what a platform is. And he says, "It is by the large-scale imposition of fixed generic protocols of inclusion and interaction, such as the city, that any platform is able to sustain the weird, richly nuanced divisions of labor and life that allow people to pursue the joys of their most marginal idiosyncrasies. This is only paradoxical if you begin with an axiomatic negation of power and form, real or imagined. So in other words, governmentality is a technology for the care of the social. It is not an obscenity." And I think there's a lot of sort of interesting resonances in there. So this idea of governmentality, for one thing, being necessary for platforms to produce them, to enable various life forms to sort of emerge on top of a platform. But a platform here is something which enables a number of other different behaviors and different sort of lifestyles to emerge on top of it. And I think another sort of intuitive sense here, we can think of Facebook as a massive platform as well. So it provides services for free, but increasingly other businesses are provided through its platform. And this is particularly important when you start thinking about how developing countries are connecting to the internet. So Facebook is making a push to provide internet access for everyone, and it provides its own service for free, but it sets itself up in that process as the platform for internet access. And other services then have to go through the Facebook platform. So if you want to have access to the internet in many developing countries, Facebook is trying to build itself up as the only means of access into this space. And obviously, this is sort of a business-oriented decision to build a platform, a particular type of platform. Now, I think in general, platforms can be identified as the basic material and ideational structures of society. So they are embedded in things as varied as railroads, ideologies, network architecture, and systems of knowledge. And what they do is that they make certain actions and certain social formations more or less likely. And they prescribe certain behaviors, and they create conduits for actions and thoughts. And in this sense, if we were to sort of put it in a Kantian register, the platform is something like a materialized transcendental. It is the conditions of possibility for an array of behaviors and thoughts. And I want to specify here that actually platforms do not cause actions, thoughts, and desires. So this isn't a sort of technological determinist argument. Instead, the idea is that they shape them. Instead of determining them or causing them, they only shape them and enable and sort of facilitate certain actions. The platform in a certain way, because it's so open, because it doesn't determine things and cause things, is intrinsically experimental. So by definition, it is sort of thrown into the world without fully knowing what will happen beyond the mere fact that it can be used. And it's going to provide some capacity for new actions, thoughts, and desires. So Facebook, for instance, when you put the Facebook platform out there at first, you don't know how people are going to use it, only that it could potentially be used. And Facebook, as it's developed, has sort of registered how people are actually using it and trying to change the platform on the basis of that. But the idea here is that you can do something new once a platform is built. So to give some obvious examples, with airline infrastructure, you can travel across the ocean in less than a day. With social media platforms, you can communicate in real time across the globe. And with the manipulation of biological platforms, you can start experimenting with sexual identities, for instance. Now, how these ideas, or how these sort of novel capacities enabled by the platform are taken up is dependent as much on the social structure and individual desires as it is by material possibilities. But the key sort of thing is you have to have these possibilities in place at first in order to make them possible. Now, I think platforms, the idea of platforms, shares with the mode of productions the idea that certain conditions need to be met before a new mode of production can emerge. So Engels makes this argument, for instance, the idea that transitioning to communism is not simply a voluntaristic leap. We can't just have communism because we all decide that we want it. We actually have to have the material conditions in place to bring it about. And Lenin also makes this argument as well. So the socialization of the production process which capitalism brings about, the development of administration in large banks, which we'll see a bit later, all of these things need to be in place first before you can have something like communism. So the idea here is that with the mode of production and with platforms, you have to have these material aspects in place before we can start thinking about actually building communism, post-capitalism, whatever the case may be. Now we can sort of set this idea, I think, in opposition to some sort of largely marginal movements among the left today, but you still see them quite vocal at times. So there's sort of the primitivist and anti-civilization movements, which broadly say that our infrastructure today is the source of our problems, and that actually we should end industrialization, end sort of any mechanized agriculture whatsoever, and basically destroy our infrastructure. This is opposed to the platform idea that you have to build on top of what we have. And you can sort of see this in practice as well, with the Khmer Rouge's takeover of Cambodia, and the implementation of their plan, Year Zero plan, which basically aimed to revert back away from industrialization and to start afresh. And of course, this led to massive famines and a massive death count as well. So these sorts of things in practice seem quite terrible. At least some of the primitivists will acknowledge that this is actually the end result of what they're talking about. I see a question about the post-growth movement, which I think is somewhat different because post-growth movement is more about a stable state rather than reverting back and getting rid of what we have. And post-growth movement, it depends partly as well upon what's meant by growth. So if we're measuring growth by GDP, I think you could find a lot of support for the idea that GDP is a poor measure of growth, and we should actually think about sort of keeping GDP growth at a more stable balance than it is at the moment. That being said, I'm quite on board with the idea that we do still want to expand, we do still want to grow. I think this is where most of our freedoms come through, is through the development of technologies and our capacities. So I think post-growth as a sort of like stable state for everything isn't a great idea. But to get back to the sort of people who also want to aim for a more sort of destructive take on the infrastructure and the platforms that we have, there's also Benjamin's essay, Walter Benjamin's essay, called The Destructive Character, where destruction becomes the precondition of novelty. And I think this is somewhat, in practice, this is very much the Khmer Rouge sort of route. And Benjamin writes there, what exists he reduced to rubble, not for the sake of rubble, but for that of the way leading through it. So again, there's sort of this idea that, well, destruction is supposed to lead to novelty and creation, but I'm not quite convinced that that's a particularly useful way to approach existing infrastructure. So I think sort of contrary to Benjamin's famous image of pulling the emergency brakes of history's locomotive, I think perhaps the more apt image would be of pulling the lever for the railroad switch and directing history in a different direction. So not stopping, but actually reorienting ourselves in a different way. So to get back to platforms, I think with them, there's no sort of idea of teleology. It gives up on this idea that there's a sort of necessary progress to history. But there are conditions to be met before a new mode of production can emerge, even if there is no necessity in this transition. So I think it implies a stages conception of history, and I think that if you want to discuss post-capitalism without work, with abundance, these sorts of things, you need to be talking about, you have to imply a stages conception of history. So it asserts the rather basic point that if you want a world of all these things, you need the material means to make them happen. And I think an important point of all this is to move beyond the binary, which is quite common, at least usually implicitly, but sometimes explicitly as well, which is this binary and leftist discourse between either one is focused on class struggle or you're an economic determinist. And these are sort of the only two paths you can take for the idea of structuring history. So what is the real motor force of history? Either it's the development of the productive forces on one hand or class struggle on the other hand. It's sort of assumed that these are mutually exclusive. And I don't think that that's the right way to look at it. And what platforms sort of give you a conceptual tool to think about is the ways in which they enable, say, certain forms of class struggle, but also then how class struggle changes those means of productions, changes those platforms as well. So I think you need to see those two things, class struggle, development of productive forces, as parallel developments. Now with platforms, if we're going to be talking about the transition to post-capitalism in terms of platforms, I think the immediate political question becomes that of repurposing, which is simply the question of can they enable different social relations to emerge, or are they constitutively bound to capitalist social relations? So I want to sort of start off here as an illustration of this idea of repurposing with a discussion of the two readings for this week, which was two of Marx's most famous texts, I think. Now I chose them because they reflect on the same entity from two quite different perspectives. And this is the idea of the automatic factory, which emerges in both of these texts, chapter 15 of volume 1, and then the famous fragment on the machines from the Grundrisse. So the automatic factory makes an appearance in both of these, but Marx comes at it from a very different perspective in each reading. And I think that these different perspectives aren't a contradiction in any terms. It's not Marx contradicting himself, but instead they reveal the sort of inherent contradictions or in a less sort of Hegelian terminology, the inherent sort of ambiguities of technology itself and the capitalist development of technology. So that's why I chose these two texts, because I think they very nicely show this process. So Marx was obviously a very keen observer of the technological changes wrought by the emerging capitalism of his time. And for Marx, I think technology was both, in the first place, the basis of a post-capitalist society, particularly insofar as its productivity enabled the liberation from work and want. So there's various places in German ideology where he outlines the fact that developing the productive forces is necessary for abundance and to avoid the generalization of want. But it's also in the fragment on the machines, the development of the material, the means of production is necessary for the liberation from work. So Marx sees technology on the one hand as the basis for a post-capitalist society. On the other hand, though, he also sees it as the basis of class hierarchies, insofar as machines were used to control workers. And sometimes this occurred through de-skilling, but this is not always the only way machines can be used to sort of further class struggle. And at one point, Marx writes, and I think he was very aware of the sort of let's say the political nature of technology. So he writes at one point that the working class cannot. It's quite interesting in terms of, you know, Lenin and the sort of Russian Revolution and how they decided to try and take things over. Marx sort of warning them in advance that this wasn't going to work the way they thought it would. Now there's a few sort of conceptual distinctions I want to make, pull out from Marx. And some of these are explicit distinctions he makes. Some of them, I think, are distinctions which make sense of what's going on in the means of production today. So the first sort of concept is the idea of a tool, which is a simple instrument wielded by a worker. We could use the image of a hammer here as a sort of classic example of a tool. Marx then talks about machinery as something different. And for Marx, machinery has three different components. One is that it has a source of power, so it could be, you know, a sort of nuclear power plant or windmill or something like this, but it has some source of electrical power. It has a transmission mechanism to take that power source and bring the energy to the third aspect, which is the tool itself. So that first sort of aspect of the tool then gets brought into the machine, and it gets run by a non-human source of power. So that's the sort of second level that Marx brings out. Now there's a third level, which is a system of machinery. And this is what I take Marx to mean by the automatic factory. And this is multiple machines working together, coordinated and operating together in a way in which they sort of impinge upon each other. So the demands of one machine then sort of place demands on other machines as well. And you can think about a massive sort of assembly line factory as a good example of this. Now I think when Marx is talking about an automatic factory, this isn't quite what we mean by automation today. In particular, Marx considers the automatic factory as still dependent upon workers. So he is not referring to a sort of fully automated system here. It's just one in which machines appear, from the worker's perspective, they appear to have a life of their own, to be automatons. So the machines sort of take on a life of their own here, and this is what Marx means by an automatic factory. So I think it's important to keep in mind that when he's talking about the worst aspects of the automatic factory, it's not a fully automated factory in the sense that we would talk about it today. So this is quite different from the idea of a labor-free factory. And I was just reading today, for instance, that there's one being created right now in South China where the workforce is going to be cut by 90%, and it's only going to be management and IT work involved in this factory. There's not going to be any sort of workers out on the production lines at all. This is quite different, I think, than what Marx is talking about in terms of the worker being faced up with the automatic factory. Now we also need to add, I think, an additional aspect of contemporary automation, and this is something beyond Marx, which Marx couldn't really have known about. This is the sort of cybernetic aspect of automation, which is that it involves some sort of feedback mechanism. So automation today has a capacity to sense, interpret, and then output react essentially to a sort of dynamically changing environment. And this is quite important for the very contemporary changes in the means of production. So if we look at these new changes in the means of production, we can see the two main changes are, first of all, in the feedback mechanism itself. So if we start thinking about machine learning here, this is essentially a development in the feedback mechanism of an automatic factory. And importantly, with machine learning, we're developing feedback and mechanisms which don't rely upon an explicit understanding of the task at hand. So it used to be the case that if you wanted to build a sort of automated machine with a feedback mechanism in it, you had to understand the task that you wanted it to do. You had to program the task in, and then the machine could sort of respond to changing conditions as a result of that. And if you look at sort of the literature involved in technology replacing labor over the past 4 decades, this is what people have been discussing is routine labor, jobs which can be explicitly sort of codified, have been the ones which have been replaced by technology. But what we're seeing today is something different, which is that with machine learning, you don't have to know how to codify a job. So something like medical diagnostics, for instance. If you have a cancerous mole, we don't need to know the various characteristics which make a mole cancerous. We only need to have the machine learn how to recognize a cancerous mole. And what this means effectively is that non-routine jobs are now being subject to automation as well. So these are all sorts of different jobs which have been largely the preserve of humans until now, are suddenly under threat of automation. But if you go back to sort of Marx's distinctions and building upon that, this is a change in the feedback mechanism. And the other aspect I think we're seeing major changes in is the tool aspect of the machine. It's particularly within advanced robotics. So you have robots with much finer and more rapid motor control skills than ever before. So they can do things which took a lot of precision and which had to rely upon a human to do beforehand, can now be done by robots. And this is an improvement in the tool aspect of the machine. And there's a robot called Baxter, for instance, which again sort of gets beyond this routine, non-routine binary, because Baxter can be intuitively and flexibly programmed through following human action. So effectively what you do with Baxter is you actually guide it through the motions of what you need it to do. It then learns those motions and can do them again and again and again. So you don't have to be able to codify the action. You only have to be able to actually do it and lead the robot through it. So again, this is, developments in the contemporary means of production seem to be along 2 lines, the feedback mechanism and the tool aspect of the machine. So I now want to turn to a more sort of explicit discussion of the 2 readings for this week. Just go through them, I guess, briefly, and sort of see exactly what Marx is talking about when he's discussing the automatic factory. Now, so chapter 15 of volume 1, I think is useful because this is where Marx probably most clearly lays out the demolishing effects of machinery on human labor. So this is him at his most negative when it comes to the effects of machinery. And in the first section, he points out that with machinery, the need for muscle power declines, and the need for supple labor increases. So you don't have to have a sort of big muscular-bound people anymore. And in Marx's words, this leads to more women and children being put to work. So this is one way in which machinery increases exploitation. It enables the exploitation of child labor quite easily. And you also need, children to sort of work these machines when it's small parts, things like this. Now, machinery is also used, in Marx's words here, is used to enable a larger labor force by including women and children in the labor force, and it therefore enables capitalists to break the power of male workers. So there's various, this is sort of an attack again, a sort of class struggle attack on the power of labor. So this is one of the effects of machinery. But Marx points out the machinery also provides both the conditions and the incentives to extend the working day. So first of all, machines can continue running indefinitely, and it forces workers to work longer. So you don't have to worry about a collective sort of running out of energy. Instead, the machines can keep going and going and going. And also there's a sort of incentive, an economic incentive, to use the machine up faster, which allows the value of the machine to transfer quicker to its products. So this is because machines undergo 3 different types of depreciation. So there's the first aspect of depreciation, which is from use. So this idea that, you know, the elements of a machine wear down over time, they have to be maintained and all of these sorts of things. But there's also depreciation from a lack of use. This is the idea that nature wears it down, and you just aren't making money when it's not in use. But the most important one, I think, for Marx is the idea of moral depreciation, which is the idea that the machine loses its value. And it's sort of important to recognize here that the value of the machine and the value that it transfers to commodities is dependent not upon the value that it was purchased for, but its replacement value. Now, because of this moral depreciation, there's an incentive to use the machine up as quickly as possible. And the best way to do this is obviously to extend the working day. So rather than stopping it and starting it up each day, just extend the working day, and it's the cheapest way to produce more value. So it doesn't require more investment on new machines and resources by the capitalist. You've already got the machine there. And equally, the lack of using machine means it just goes to waste. So there's all these sorts of economic incentives to just run the machine 24 hours a day. So this is sort of, again, the detrimental effect that Marx sees with machinery, is that it makes the working day become a 24-hour thing, the sort of rise of shift work and all of these things. Now the third aspect that Marx sees coming about from machinery is the intensification of labor. So at the same time as there's incentives to extend the working day, there's also an intense pressure to intensify the working day. Now this partly results because of legislation to shorten the working day, so working towards, you know, a 10-hour working day, eventually towards an 8-hour working day. This leads to more pressure to make labor productive in that time period. So you have sort of the emergence of things like piecework labor. So you get paid for doing, you know, a particular project, and once you completed it, you're done. You're not paid by the amount of time, but instead by your results. So this sort of piecework labor is used to compel the worker to work more intensely. But the intensification of work, of course, just leads to the draining of the worker, a physically exhausting sort of thing. And if you've ever done factory work, you can sort of get the sense, even if you're not sort of operating in a physically demanding job, just the mental stress of being in a repetitive job day after day after day is exhausting. And this is the sort of thing that Marx is pointing out emerges because of machinery. Now there's certain points where the second aspect, this extension of the working day, and the third aspect, the intensification of the working day, come into conflict. So basically it's sort of a marathon versus a sprint. So either you extend the working day too far and the intensity of work must drop as a result. So this is a sort of marathon idea. Or you make the working day very intense, but then the day must be shortened. So it's more of a sprint as a result. And capitalism can't really have both at the same time. So there's a constant sort of capitalist battle to balance between these two. So the drive to extend work and the drive to intensify work at the same time. This is one of these, you know, contradictions within capitalism. Now, if we get to the next section in this chapter, this is where Marx starts to talk about the automatic factory. So in the automatic factory, skill becomes taken over by the machine. And we'll see this in the fragment on machines. This is, you know, the sort of emergence of the general intellect, where skill and knowledge and all of these sorts of things are increasingly implemented into the machinery itself, the fixed capital. And through this process, workers become increasingly de-skilled, and in Marx's prediction, this means that the hierarchies of skill between different workers are going to disappear. So according to him, the division of labor becomes not so much premised upon technical and skill-based hierarchies, but instead it becomes determined by the needs of the machine. And it's just a sort of, you know, everybody's skilled the same way. And in his own words, he says, Only simple cooperation, therefore, takes place between them. Now, the simplicity of the work, the de-skilling of laborers, it enables workers to be moved wherever they need, and it enables rapid turnover as well. So I used to work in one factory, for instance, Kellogg's factory, a cereal factory of all things. And every day you would come in and you would be working at a different job. All of these jobs were simply de-skilled enough that you could go and do them very easily. You didn't need much training on any of them. And so it was just, very easy to A, replace workers, B, delegate workers wherever they're needed. And it enables rapid turnover as well. So the sort of threat of leaving or a sort of strike is not so much of a threat when work is de-skilled. You can bring in, for instance, scabs to take over the work. So again, this is one of the sort of detrimental effects of machinery. In addition to all of that, the factory system is just sort of intrinsically physically dangerous to workers. So massive machines moving all this, massive amount of resources around, is quite easy for workers to get hurt from all of this. So Marx in this sort of this chapter, and I think more broadly in Volume 1 as well, sees machinery largely in a negative sense. He sees them as something imposed by capitalists and by the capitalist accumulation process. And he writes in a justifiably famous claim that it would be possible to write a whole history of the inventions made since 1830 for the sole purpose of providing capital with weapons against working class revolt. And I think this is very much what he attempts to do within Volume 1, is to sort of write this history, to look at the implementation of different machines and technologies, not as something beneficial to workers, which it isn't, at least in his time, and not as something just solely for the accumulation of value, but actually as something that's part of this political process of class struggle. So I think to sort of summarize this section, what we effectively see is that machinery enables capital to exploit women and children, to undermine trade unions, to extend the working day, to intensify work, to de-skill laborers, and to throw workers into a very dangerous environment. This is sort of the takeaway point from Marx's discussion of machines within this volume. So that's one perspective on the machines. If we turn now to the machines, very famous piece, obviously, and typically Marx's discussion here has been examined for its suggestions about the general intellect and the decline of the labor theory of value, which is one of the things that autonomists and Antonio Negri pick out in particular. Now, it's an immensely rich text. We can maybe discuss it if people want to. But I want to look at this text today more for its discussion of the automatic factory and how this relates to the discussion of the automatic factory within Capital Volume 1. Now, I may have my dates a bit wrong here, but I think it's about a 10-year gap between Marx writing the fragment on the machines, 10 years pass, and then he writes Capital Volume 1. So you can see how his perspective sort of changes over time as well. But so in the fragment of the machines, he begins by declaring that fixed capital, by which he means tools, machines, factories, infrastructures, these sorts of things, fixed capital culminates in the automatic system of machinery. And this is a system of machinery which is set in motion by an automaton. So again, it's this idea, not quite the automatic factory as we think about it today, but something which appears to have a life of its own to the worker. So here the machines take on the skills and strength which had traditionally been the domain of the human laborer. So the worker is regulated by the machine rather than the opposite. So this is the distinction between a tool and machine for Marx. So a tool is something which is dominated by the human laborer. The human has control over a hammer, determines the pace of work, determines what to do with the hammer. Whereas when the machine emerges, suddenly it's the machine who takes over the rhythms of work, the tempo of it, and the one who tells the worker what needs to be done to use the machine properly. So with the automatic system of factory, the automatic factory, this is sort of what emerges. And yeah, this is very much the question about automation on the side. This is one of the ways in which Marx sees alienation occurring. I think there's multiple ways in which he sees alienation. So one of the dominant aspects is to see that workers are no longer producing their own goods. Instead, it becomes a sort of collective labor, and they don't really have much say in the end product. But another aspect is that they don't have any control over the tempo and dynamism of their own labor anymore, and instead it's determined by machines. And I think it's important to point out here as well that what Marx is trying to do is not to blame this so much on the machines, but instead to point out how this is determined by capitalism and determined by capitalists. So it's not quite the machine's fault here, so much as it's the valorization process which demands that machines are used in this way. It's capitalists which sort of delegate authority and delegate discipline to machines, and it becomes a sort of informal and inhuman form of domination, rather than the personalized domination of a manager, for instance, telling you what to do. Instead, it appears to the worker as a machine telling you what to do. But this is, again, yeah, a part of alienation. Now, Marx writes in this section that actually the machines take over so much that it is no longer a labor process per se, given that labor is no longer in control. And I think this is sort of interesting for some of the technical debates about labor process theory in the 1950s and the latter half of the 20th century. That actually maybe we shouldn't be describing it as a labor process anymore. Now, the development of machinery results from the tendency for capital to increase productivity and to decrease necessary labor. And Marx writes here, quoting from him, "The accumulation of knowledge and of skill, of the general productive forces of the social brain, is thus absorbed into capital as opposed to labor, and hence appears as an attribute of capital, and more specifically of fixed capital, insofar as it enters into the production process as a means of production proper." So this is again this idea that the sort of scientific knowledge, technical knowledge, collective knowledge built up by humans then gets integrated into fixed capital, integrated into machines. And if you look at sort of later autonomous thinkers who very much draw upon this idea, but they also critique it as well. So the social brain, for somebody like Paulo Verno, for instance, doesn't just exist in fixed capital. And he thinks that this is one of the problems that Marx runs into. And he points out that actually the social brain, or the general intellect, as Marx will call it later, also exists in living labor. So it still exists within humans. It's not fully delegated to machines. And then capital, therefore, continues to exploit living labor through this. So Marx in this section will sort of assume that capitalist exploitation only occurs by sort of exploitation of general intellect embodied in fixed capital. The autonomists say, well, no, actually, it also exploits the general intellect as embodied in living labor. So that's just sort of an aside there as one of the, I guess, links to more contemporary Marxisms. So Marx then writes that the productive force of society is measured in fixed capital, exists there in its objective form, and inversely the productive force of capital grows with this general progress, which capital appropriates free of charge. This again has to sort of do with the idea that this general intellect is constituted, built up out of sort of collective labor done outside of work, which then capitalism appropriates. So direct labor, the sort of actual physical labor of working on a commodity, on a product, this direct labor becomes less and less important in production as science and technology and cooperative labor become more and more important. And at a certain stage of development, Marx believes that science and technology become so essential to capitalism that they become a business themselves, which directs research into furthering the production process. So in a very strong way here, Marx is predicting the rise of scientific management, these sorts of things, and the development of further productive forces through research and science. So then Marx then writes that the development of fixed capital indicates to what degree social knowledge has become a direct force of production, and to what degree, hence, the conditions of the process of social life have come under the control of the general intellect and been transformed in accordance with it. This is the famous line where Marx introduces the idea of the general intellect, which he earlier sort of referenced as the social brain. But to sum up so far, in this section, what Marx has argued is that the full development of capital results in the first place, the means of labor, which at one point in time were just simple tools, but the means of labor now appear as fixed capital from the perspective of the valorization process, and they appear paradigmatically as machinery and the automatic factory from the perspective of the worker. In the production process, as the full development of capitalism occurs, the production process is taken over, and this is a quote from Marx, the technological application of science, instead of being organized by something like the skill of the worker. And this is what Marx sees as the full development of capital within the fragment on the machines. Now, importantly, Marx writes that, I think this is the sort of turning point of the argument here, is that, however, while capital gives itself its adequate form as use value within the production process only in the form of machinery and other material manifestations of fixed capital, this in no way means that this use value, machinery as such, is capital, or that its existence as machinery is identical with its existence as capital. And he continues, machinery does not lose its use value as soon as it ceases to be capital. While machinery is the most appropriate form of the use value of fixed capital, it does not at all follow that therefore subsumption under the social relation of capital is the most appropriate and ultimate social relation of production for the application of machinery. So it's a very, very long quote, but this is a very, very direct argument from Marx that machinery has an existence and an importance outside of capitalist social relations, and that to sort of mistake existing platforms and means of production today for the sort of for being only capitalist would be a mistake. That these things have use values which, while they may be useful for capitalism, still have other use values that would be useful for any sort of post-capitalist project. So to sort of answer the question of why is machinery deployed by capital, so why does it use all this machinery? And essentially it's, again, as always with capitalism, has to do with the valorization process. And machinery produces value in two ways. First of all, it transfers value to the product by having its own value. And second of all, it increases the relation of surplus labor to necessary labor. And it therefore cheapens the goods required for the worker to live. So it increases, in a way, the surplus value that can be extracted from living labor. Now, this latter point is particularly why capitalists deploy machinery, to effectively extend the amount of time that workers are working for capitalists rather than their own subsistence. Now, at the same time, and this is what is missing from the account of machinery, I think, in Volume 1, Marx writes here, and this is, I think, one of the crucial sort of lines from the fragment on machines. He writes that capital here, quite unintentionally, reduces human labor, expenditure of energy to a minimum. This will redound to the benefit of emancipated labor and is the condition of its emancipation. I think what's sort of important here is to pull out the fact that this is an effect of capitalist production, of capitalist use of technology, but it's an unintentional effect. And it's a condition of emancipation for any sort of post-capitalist world. And this is what I think is the contradictory development of technology within capitalism. So if we go back to what I said at the very beginning of the class, that even if we accept the idea that capitalism fully determines the development of technology today, which I think is a very strong claim that probably doesn't hold up, but even if we do accept that claim, there's still a contradictory development of technology within capitalism. And this leads to a particular contradiction within capitalism as well. So Marx writes, while direct labor time remains the determinant factor in the production of wealth, as fixed capital develops, the production of real wealth is determined more and more by the general state of science and on the progress of technology or the application of this science to production. So to again draw another quote here, as soon as labor in the direct form has ceased to be the great wellspring of wealth, labor time ceases and must cease to be its measure. And hence exchange value must cease to be the measure of use value. And I think effectively what we see here is that the very law of value, which is so essential to the capitalist system, is broken down by the development of the productive forces and the development of the general intellect. Or at least, if not broken down, there becomes a sort of contradiction and a tension here, which is that the system produces an abundance of goods with a minimal amount of labor on the one, the capitalist law of value. So by direct labor time, by abstract socially necessary labor time. So this is a sort of contradiction that emerges from the contradiction within the development of technology, and it becomes a crisis of capitalism. So Marx writes here, the capital itself is the moving contradiction, and that it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum, while it posits labor time on the other side as sole measure and source of wealth. So this, I think, is one of the most interesting sort of arguments about the sort of contradictions and crises of capitalism within Marx, and particularly because it's focused on, again, the automatic factory, which in Volume 1 is seen as such a horrendous sort of thing, but here it's seen as the condition of emancipation. And again, another sort of long quote here from Marx, but he writes that the free development of individualities, which Marx says is premised upon the general reduction of necessary labor of society to a minimum, this free development of individuals then corresponds to the artistic, scientific, etc. development of the individuals in the time set free and with the means created for all of them. And this is, I think, another important aspect, which is that previous societies have created free time, but they've always created free time for the few. There's always been a handful of elite people who have managed to live off the labor of others and have free time for themselves. But capitalism unintentionally creates free time for the many. Now, it requires surplus labor in order to be able to appropriate its products. But as Marx writes in another quote here, it is thus, despite itself, instrumental in creating the means of social disposable time in order to reduce the labor time for the whole of society to a diminishing minimum, and thus to free everyone's time for their own development. Now the problem here is that capitalism still tends to convert this disposable time into surplus labor time. So we're not simply given free time, instead we're forced to work, compelled to work in various other ways. So because of this contradiction, though, Marx argues the workers must themselves appropriate their own surplus labor. And after this, he writes, necessary labor time will be measured by the needs of the social individual, and productivity will grow to such a degree, and this is a quote from him, that even though production is now calculated for the wealth of all, disposable time will grow for all. And again, another quote, a final quote from him. The measure of wealth is then not any longer in any way labor time, but rather disposable time. And I think this is a culmination here of all of Marx's sort of thinking about the productive forces, about where they're supposed to lead to, and how they enable the conditions for a sort of post-work society. So I think what we get in the fragment on machines is therefore a much different picture of machinery than we do in capital. So the development of machinery and the development of the automatic factory becomes the unintentional means to emancipation. And at the same time, capital produces technology for its own ends, but it also builds, to use the sort of classic image, it doesn't build the grave diggers of its own demise, but perhaps it builds the shovels which enable that grave to be built. So there's therefore this sort of liberating aspect to the development of fixed capital. even if at the same time it entails all the sorts of miseries that are outlined in Volume 1. And I think we need to see these things not as a contradiction in Marx, but actually as an existing contradiction within the productive forces of capitalism. So I think what we see here is a sort of basis for what I want to talk about for the rest of today, which is that even in a situation where capital has utterly determined the reorganization of the production process, where we have real and total subsumption, there are still ambiguities in technology. So capitalist technology remains filled with tensions, and therefore something like the idea of repurposing is possible. And this is what I want to discuss for the rest of today. To elaborate this thesis of repurposing, and what does it mean? Are there any questions at the moment? Does anybody want to raise an issue or a question? Okay. Yeah, Jordan, you want to? Interesting. I don't know disposable life in Agamben. I can sort of imagine what he means by it. I think there is actually some overlap between the two, which, insofar as you look at disposable time, actually exists in, say, today's society. Disposable time is not evenly distributed. Disposable time, in a certain sense, is distributed amongst, a certain class of people who continue to work 40, 60, 80-hour work weeks. You also have a smaller elite who manage to not work that much, who have disposable time, which is also sort of luxury time. But then you also have a production of surplus populations who have sort of disposable time in this minimal sense, that they're not working in a formal wage job, but they're also disposable life. They become completely excess to capitalism. They become completely surplus. They serve no sort of purpose for capitalism beyond exerting pressure on the working class and those who are employed. And so I think that you can sort of see that there is some overlap between disposable time and disposable life. So looking at the sort of uneven distribution of it. But I don't know exactly how Agamben uses the term, so I'm not sure if maybe that matches up with what he's thinking or not. Okay, so a question from Jordan. Yeah, this might be a good question to sort of Taco wants to sort of discuss repurposing, which is what I want to talk about in this next section here. So I'll leave it aside. I think the energy thing is interesting because there are sort of decent capitalist incentives to sort of to actually adopt solar energy, for instance. So I'm a bit more relaxed about that. But we can talk about that afterwards. I think it's a good question. But so let me discuss repurposing then. So I'll start off with a very basic definition here and explore how this definition sort of changes as we wind our way through a few different examples. So I want to define repurposing up front as the use of old means for new ends. So a very sort of basic definition. But I'm particularly interested here in technological repurposing. But there's also quite obviously a number of different entities and processes which could also be repurposed. So you could repurpose, language. You could repurpose cultural materials, things like this. But I want to trace out a sort of history of repurposing, because actually, I think it's been a dominant tactic over the past 150 years. And it's sort of interesting to trace out the mutations in the idea of repurposing throughout that time. So in the first place, repurposing can be recognized as a sort of contemporary variant on the tactic of seizing the means of production. So if we look back into Engels' writing, Engels calls for the proletariat to take state power and to turn the means of production into social property. So now Engels claims that with this act, the classes will no longer have any meaning, and therefore the state as a tool of class power will be abolished. He thinks that commodity production will end. He thinks that the anarchy of the market will be replaced by some sort of organized plan for production. Now, which in the first place that is far too abstract. So what does it mean to socially own the means of production? This is something that, empirically becomes a big issue in the history of the USSR when they were trying to determine what are the appropriate limits of state appropriation. So should small-scale peasants be appropriated as well? Should people be enabled to have, grow their own sort of, crops in the backyard, have chickens in their backyard, or should that be appropriated by the state as well? Or should it only be large-scale industry? And if so, which particular industries, these sorts of things. So the sort of question of what does it socially mean, or what does it mean to socially own the means of production is left very abstract in Engels' account. Now there's also this implicit neutrality that he applies to the means of production. So he's silent on the possible political implications. And at least in his writings that I've seen, it's assumed to be a very simple process to repurpose the means of production towards different ends. You can simply just grasp them, take them, turn them towards a different end. Now this idea of seizing the means of production then gets taken up by Lenin. I think is the next sort of major figure to discuss this idea. Now obviously under capitalism, the means of production are privately owned. And for Lenin, to seize them means to use the state to turn them into social property. So the moment of repurposing therefore involves a shift for Lenin, a shift in property relations. So changing who owns them will be sufficient to change how they are used. And I think I want to cite a long quote from Lenin here, which is quite a sort of accelerationist quote. But I think it's also a bit naive in terms of how it thinks this sort of thing would be used. So I apologize here, it's a long quote, but he writes that capitalism has created an accounting apparatus in the shape of banks, syndicates, postal service, consumer societies, and office employees' unions. Without big banks, socialism would be impossible. The big banks are the state apparatus which we need to bring about socialism, and which we take ready-made from capitalism. Our task here is merely to lop off what capitalistically mutilates this excellent apparatus to make it even bigger, even more democratic, even more comprehensive. Quantity will be transformed into quality. A single state bank, the biggest of the big, with branches in every rural district, in every factory, will constitute as much as 9/10 of the socialist apparatus. This will be a countrywide bookkeeping, countrywide accounting of the production and distribution of goods. This will be, so to speak, something in the nature of the skeleton of socialist society. And I think here you get a very clear sense of exactly what repurposing means for Lenin, which is, a sort of admirable ambition about what should be done, but also a sort of naive sense about how simple it is to simply lop off the capitalist aspects of these things and turn them towards socialist ends. And for Lenin, he explicitly says that this is part of the first stage of communism. So Marx famously in the Critique of the Gotha program outlines two different sorts of stages of communism. And for Lenin, this is part of the first stage of communism. And so he says that there are limits to this repurposing, which I think is interesting to point out. So Lenin thinks that seizing the means of production, in his words, does not remove the defects of distribution and the inequality of bourgeois laws, which continue to prevail or will disappear, and the distinction between mental and physical labor. So that sort of thing will still exist even after the seizure of the means of production. I think in one of the most important comments he makes in State and Revolution, he writes that control is taken from the capitalists, but the technical experts remain in place. So again, this is a quote from him. The question of control in accounting should not be confused with the question of the scientifically trained staff of engineers, agronomists, and so on. These gentlemen are working today in obedience to the wishes of the capitalists and will work even better tomorrow in obedience to the wishes of the armed workers. So I think this is a really interesting point where you can sort of see the limits of Lenin's conceptions of technology, which is that the notion that technical expertise is always a sort of neutral and apolitical thing that can be simply repurposed towards any possible end. Now, I think you don't want to go the complete opposite way and say that technical expertise is just political, but I think there is a sort of naivety to Lenin's idea of technical expertise here. But to summarize here, in the sort of seizure of the means of production, I think in both Engels and Lenin, we find an idea of repurposing which holds to 4 different characteristics. So the first one is that we must wait until after the revolution in order for repurposing to be possible. We must also hold to an idea where it is the state who accomplishes the repurposing. Now both of them also see a shift in property relations as the fundamental condition for repurposing, and both tend to assume that the machinery and technology of capitalism can simply be reoriented towards post-capitalist ends. So this is the sort of conception, I think, that we can of repurposing that we can find within Engels and within Lenin in this traditional debate around the seizure of the means of production. Is those sort of 4 characteristics. Now I want to fast forward a bit to the Situationist International and their idea of détournement as another sort of idea of repurposing. And this was a dominant tactic of the Situationist International. And famously it was said, this is a quote, "There can be no situationist painting or music, but only a situationist use of those means." The sort of idea of repurposing old materials becomes central to the Situationist International. And as the translator of Guy Debord notes, the French word détournement means deflection, diversion, rerouting, distortion, misuse, misappropriation, hijacking, or otherwise turning something aside from its normal course or purpose. And it was intended, this sort of technique was intended as a powerful cultural weapon. And it was an attempt to use old cultural materials in order to create new meanings. And it required a critical distance from the established world. So you had to sort of step back from existing meanings in order to be able to reuse them. And it justified itself through its own success. So rather than any sort of relation to a previous usage. It wasn't, did it make sense in terms of old terms, but does it create a new meaning in its own sort of sense? And it must contain, in the way it's used, it must contain part of the older piece of material in order to highlight the tension between the old meaning and the new meaning on the other hand. Now what I think is interesting about their conception here is that it was not just an attempt to subvert or negate a previous system. It was not merely disruptive or an empty negation for its own sake. And instead it attempts to produce something new through the reconfiguration of old materials. The other aspect which I find quite interesting about their conception, their implicit sort of idea of repurposing, is that it's not state-centric, and it doesn't take a revolution before you can start thinking about repurposing. It's something which can be done in everyday life. So here I think we find an idea of repurposing which holds to a sort of set of different characteristics. Now in the first place, problematically, I think is focused solely on using artistic materials. Now there's some sort of suggestions that it could be applied to urban space itself, but to my knowledge at least, that doesn't really get carried out much within sort of situationist work, situationist practice. So it's mostly focused on artistic materials. Now it's also focused, its intention is to produce new sorts of meanings rather than changing the material platform of society. So I think this is again a sort of limitation. Ultimately the two are intertwined. Meanings and the sort of material platform of society are intertwined. But manipulating something like a propaganda poster is not the same thing as repurposing, say, an IT system. Now Now, as I mentioned already, unlike Engels and Marx, the situationist practice was something which could be taken up virtually any time and anywhere. It could be taken up in everyday life, and it didn't need to wait for a revolution. And virtually anyone could take it up as a practice as well. It was something which, the average person could do, and it didn't require the state as the agent of repurposing here. So I think in many ways this is sort of completely the opposite of the sort of seizure of the means in production, and a completely sort of different conception of repurposing found here. Now, another good example, I think, well, it would seem, I guess, the tactic of factory takeovers would seem to be a sort of interesting example of repurposing as well. A very good example, of course, is Argentina after the 2001 crisis. So the owners of these factories went bankrupt. The factory shut down. Instead of the workers sort of giving up, they took these factories over and started them up again. This is sort of it seems like an interesting example of repurposing. But I think the problem with this example is that these factory takeovers typically slot right in to their previous function. So the owners and management may change, but the means of production are still used to produce the same commodities for sale on the same capitalist market, while being beholden to the same imperative to make a profit and accumulate. So I think there's sort of a change in ownership here, but not actually a change in function. So I don't think most factory takeovers are actually a good example of repurposing. And I think they also sort of demonstrate the insufficiency of simply changing property relations, which both Engels and Lenin relied upon. So changing who owns the means of production can be important, but it can also simply mean that the same activity is carried out by new owners. So I don't think it's quite sufficient to think about it that way. Now, that being said, I think there's a much better example of factory-level repurposing in a series of worker-based struggles in the 1970s. So it's now sort of largely forgotten experiments, but workers in the UK, and Japan, and later in Brazil, India, and Argentina, sought to channel technological development towards the production of what they called socially useful goods. So these were goods which responded to social needs, and which were produced in such a way as to minimize waste, be ecologically sustainable, and to respect workers and their skills. That was the sort of definition of a socially useful good. Now, the most influential of these projects occurred at Lucas Aerospace in the UK. And it was a company which was focused on producing high-tech components, predominantly for the military, and it received significant government funding in order to do this. Now, it was faced at the time in the 1970s with rising structural unemployment and impending redundancies as well. And so the workers at Lucas Aerospace came together to develop an alternative proposal for how to run the company and maintain jobs. Now, the basic argument here was that given the public funds being channeled into the corporation, society should have a say and benefit from how these resources were being used. So it's an argument which meant channeling resources away from military armaments and into socially useful products. So in order to develop the proposal for these goods, it's a really interesting sort of history lesson here. What the workers did was compile a list of all the skills and equipment available to them. They took on the perspective of planners, and they sought product suggestions from workers and their communities, and then they collectively decided how these technologies and skills could be repurposed to different ends. So they came up with a plan, and rather than high-tech military equipment, the existing capacities were to be reoriented around designing and producing items like medical technologies, renewable energy, safety improvements, and heating technology for social housing. Social housing in particular, not individual houses, but actually social housing in general. And the final plan that they came up with, it ran to over 1,200 pages. And it indexed about 150 different products that could be produced with the technologies, the skills, and all of this stuff sort of available. Now, in order to achieve these political goals, against an intransigent management, they tried to essentially build up a sort of counter-hegemonic project, with workers explicitly aiming to inflame the imaginations of others and revise what people thought production was for. So repurposing was a full-scale sort of political project. It wasn't just something which took place in the workplace, but it was something which took place in the communities and socially as well. And they were meeting with, leading members of the Labour Party at the time to try and get national-level support for their project. So I think, sort of interestingly here, the Lucas Plan refused to remain a temporary space of prefigurative politics, and they instead aimed to mobilize the resources of unions and governments in an effort to create a new hegemonic order. Now, the plan resonated with a number of different peace activists, obviously not wanting military armaments anymore, but it also resonated with environmentalists, feminists, and other labor movements, and it led to a sort of international network being built and a wave of worker-led action across the world. So the problem is that in the end, the stagnation of the Labour Party at the time and national trade unions, combined with the rising turn to neoliberalism, it meant that the plan fell short of its goals. So it didn't actually end up repurposing these things in practice, but it's an interesting sort of experiment with what is possible, and I think an interesting model for what could be done today. Now, they did have some success, which was to slow job losses, and this was largely because of their work on the ground, building a sort of an alternative idea for what these technologies could be used for. So despite these failures, though, I think the Lucas Plan demonstrates a clear example of how repurposing the productive forces of society could be used to transform the technological direction of society. So this was not an attempt to simply build a worker-controlled factory in the middle of a profit-oriented economy. I think more radically, it was an attempt to reorient technological development away from marginal improvements to weapons technology, and towards, instead, socially useful goods. So I think it's sort of an ideal model of how technological knowledge, political awareness, and collective power can be aggregated into a potent repurposing of the material world. Do we have any questions so far? I'll sort of take a little break now, see if there's any questions. Okay, a question from Jordan. Yes, yeah, no, it's an excellent question. Is there another question? Okay, so Jordan's question, which I hate to postpone his question again, but I do actually come up to it in a little bit, and I think it's one of the crucial questions that I sort of want to work through throughout the entire course. I think this question is essentially the question of the political neutrality of technology, which is it neutral, or are there certain sort of political qualities embedded in technology which mean that we can't repurpose them, we have to destroy them. I'll give a very good example, which is nuclear weapons. And I think, the very function of a nuclear weapon, even if they're not used, is to inflict mass destruction. And this is something that in an imagined sort of post-capitalist world, we just have no place. So I think something like nuclear weapons is a clear example of a technology that we just can't imagine repurposing in any meaningful way. So we have to, one of the conclusions I want to draw today, and I'll get to it a bit more later, but one of the conclusions I want to do is to say that when we start thinking about repurposing, it can't be in general terms. It has to be a sort of case-by-case thing, and it has to, of necessity, deal with the technical details and the political functions and the social context involved in any sort of particular technology. This is a very sort of detailed piecemeal work. You can't just sort of willy-nilly say this technology won't work, or it can be repurposed, or it can't. So very much what I want to do in the rest of the course is to say, well, to look closely at two different technologies and see whether or not they can be repurposed or whether or not they can't. And it's sort of an open question for me at the moment. I'm inclined to believe that they can, but maybe it'll turn out that they can't. And that's something we'll sort of discover, I guess, as the course goes on. Yeah, I may sort of skip ahead a bit. I have one other final example here, which I'll briefly sort of skim through, which is the example of Cybersyn. Everybody, I assume most people know about Cybersyn by now. If you don't know, Cybersyn was an attempt in the 1970s by Chilean government to build a sort of decentralized planning system for the national economy. So it's quite different from the centralized planning system of something like the Soviet Union. And they brought in, a bunch of different technical experts to try and to build this system to allow workers to have a say in how the economy was actually run, what production was going to be for, how you're going to achieve it, all of these sorts of things. Now, I think it's sort of an interesting example of repurposing, because at the same time as they're trying to build this stuff, and they have these sort of magnificent ideas about what could be done, you also have massive U.S. pressure against the Allende government to prevent them from getting any sort of high-tech technologies. So anything like computers, for instance, were almost impossible to get. And when they tried to build Cybersyn, I think they had 4 or 5 computers in the entire country. And again, computers are massive at the time, but you have about 4 or 5 different computers, and you're trying to build essentially what's a sort of proto-internet. You had to be you had to repurpose these existing technologies in a very interesting sort of way to try and build Cybersyn. And what they ended up doing was building, using one primary computer for Cybersyn. And it sort of did statistical models, forecasts, and sort of coordinated various different machines. And then around the rest of the country, you had telex machines, which were, I guess, sort of like simple text messaging sort of thing, where you could communicate with people in virtual real time, and it enables some sort of decentralized communication. But you see here this sort of grand technological vision of Cybersyn having to repurpose and reuse the technologies at hand to bring about a sort of a not fully post-capitalist world, but a sort of interesting movement towards post-capitalism. And again, sort of as a historical counterfactual, it's quite interesting to imagine what would have happened with Cybersyn if A, there weren't all these sort of international barriers against them getting new technologies, and B, if Allende hadn't been overthrown in a US-backed coup. So it's a sort of, interesting experiment about what could have been. And I think also what you see here, when they're trying to develop Cybersyn, and this gets to sort of Jordan's question as well, is a very keen awareness of the political nature of technology. So this idea that if you're going to build Cybersyn, you can't just copy sort of techniques from other systems. Then, in fact, you have to actually build communism and socialism into the technology itself. So there's a very keen awareness that technology is political, and that if you're going to be repurposing it, it has to be sort of built in to some degree already. So to sort of sum up from these examples, factory takeovers, and the Cybersyn example, I think there's a sort of few parameters for understanding repurposing today. First is that repurposing doesn't need to be done by the state. So seizing the means of production via state takeover is not the only option. We can look at artists, worker collectives, and states as well. They all have their role to play in repurposing. We can think about it as sort of different scales as well. A second point to make is that repurposing does not need to wait until after a revolution. So actions can be taken now. And this is a sort of, imagine it as a sort of useful prefiguration which tries to build the material conditions for a new world today. A third point is that repurposing must recognize the politics of technology. So the sort of Engels and Lenin approach to seizing the means of production was a very neutral take on it all. And I think these more recent examples point to the political nature of technology. So again, we have to sort of think about their use and think about how far they can actually be repurposed or whether or not they can be repurposed. And you can see various examples of assuming technological neutrality throughout history. So there's adoption of Fordism by Trotsky and by Lenin. There's the support for Taylorism by Lenin as well. There's the acceptance of nuclear weapons by the Euro-communist parties. And then there's a sort of contemporary argument that guns don't kill people, which again relies upon this idea that weapons are simply politically neutral, and it's actually, entirely people's responsibility for using them. But this belief in the neutrality of technology, I think it's also expressed in claims that socialism is simply socialized ownership of the means of production. I think we need to be careful about simply sort of holding on to that classic idea. We need to be a bit more critical of it. So because of this belief, I think the technologies of production come to have a logical, well, because of this belief in the neutrality of technology, it was often assumed that the technologies of production would have a logical and historical priority over politics, that they would sort of develop on their own, and you get this sort of either economically determinist or technologically determinist argument about history. And I think the difficult task for us to think about repurposing today is to recognize, and I'm quoting a famous quote here, the technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. I think if we sort of unpack this, the neither good nor bad wishes to say that technology is flexible. It's open to repurposing. It can be used for different ends. The ends that it's used for right now do not exhaust its potential. And then the second part of the quote, nor is technology neutral, I think this also points to the fact that technology is not infinitely flexible. So it contains implicit politics, which can only be bent to some degree. So we can't really imagine a sort of liberating use of nuclear technologies. We can't really imagine a very liberating use of Taylorism as well. So these sorts of things are technologies which are intrinsic to their very functioning, necessary to their very functioning, is things which we wouldn't want in a post-capitalist world. And I think to sort of get to Jordan's point about what are the sort of criteria for repurposing, I think this is one of them, is to say, to look at a technology in a very in-depth case-by-case study, to look at a technology and determine what are its functions, then determine what are its very central functions. So what things are absolutely necessary for it to remain that sort of technology. And if that sort of central function is something which doesn't fit into a sort of post-capitalist world, we can then start thinking about, well, actually it's not available for repurposing. It's something that would have to be just mobilized against, destroyed, whatnot, these sorts of things. But again, it has to be a sort of case-by-case basis. And we can always sort of have political discussions about what that central function is. It's not always a clear-cut manner. So to sort of start wrapping up here, I want to bring it back to what is the significance of repurposing. So why do I think this is an important thing today? Well, there's a recent discussion by Alberto Toscano. He talks about the contemporary fascination with disruption and interruption and revolt, the sort of politics of interruption. And he notes an absence of strategic thinking about the possibilities for repurposing. And this is to say essentially that the sort of dominance of interruption and the tactical repertoire of today's radical left, I think this dominance also means an abdication of the responsibility to think strategically. So this is an issue that I'm going to return to in the final week of this course. But the essential question here is how to think tactics and strategies, means and ends together in a way which does not simply reduce the latter to the former. So this is to say, it's not the sort of common sense of prefigurative politics today that the means must match up to the ends, or this sort of dominant take, I think, in the politics of interruption, which is to say that tactics are the most important thing, and we can't really have strategy because, well, we can't change anything. The most we can do is sort of disrupt, slow down, and that's about it. So I think effectively what Toscano sort of points to in his discussion is that repurposing is the way forward if you want to think about a politics beyond just disruption, a politics beyond just sort of trying to create temporary spaces of withdrawal today. And in fact, repurposing involves a highly sort of strategic take on where politics should go and how to advance that type of politics. So I think that's sort of the importance of repurposing for broader politics today. Now I want to conclude here with the sort of, I think a sort of broad distinction that might be made. I'm not sure if this distinction works yet or not. But following Marx, a distinction between formal and real repurposing. So in formal repurposing, what we have is the tools, machines, and built environment at hand being appropriated and their primary function being reoriented. And this would be a sort of repurposing for transition, repurposing to try and get towards another world. And we can think of this as along a whole sort of hierarchy of different spatial scales as well. So from the local to the global. We could think of, for instance, benches torn from the sidewalk and tossed in the street as barricades. There's a certain sense of repurposing involved there. But you also have the Lucas Plan efforts at altering the direction of entire factories. So this is, again, a sort of higher spatial scale. And then the state-level reorienting of investment and the revolutionary seizure of the means of production. And all of these things are sort of an attempt to repurpose and take what is at hand in order to transition towards a new world. Now, on the other hand, we have a sort of real repurposing in which the very materials of our world begin to be reorganized according towards a sort of post-capitalist logic. And this is repurposing, I think, for sort of consolidation. So what technologies would be useful in a post-capitalist future, not just for getting there, to get towards a post-capitalist future, but actually, if we were to ever achieve it, that we would still want to keep around. So these are things which we may not be able to immediately turn into post-capitalist elements, but which I think can be the focus of political struggle to reorganize along post-capitalist lines. So to give a few examples here, logistics, global logistics is a good example. 3D printing. Mike Davis makes, I think, a quite powerful case for the city form as a sort of, environmentally low-carbon necessity. If we want to have, a massive population that we have today, we need cities to be repurposed in any sort of post-capitalist world. So we can sort of imagine cities of the future being high density rather than sprawling, and making efficient uses of resources and avoiding impinging upon the surrounding environment. And we might also think of cloud computing, which is an example which I just was reading Evgeny Morozov last night. And he points to the fact that in the early history of computing, they envisioned computing power and storage as a public utility. And it was something which was going to be centralized and distributed out like other utilities. So something like water, for instance. In the same way, you would just get, computing power and storage provided to you as a publicly provided utility rather than buying your own personal computer or anything like that. So unlike sort of today's privatized cloud computing, there were these sort of earlier visions of a publicly run service and a democratically run service as well. And I think we can sort of imagine a post-capitalist future where cloud computing and these sorts of things, centralized computing, would be quite useful in a variety of ways, for environmental ways, and for sort of democratic and privacy ways as well. Now, I think the simple point to make here is that post-capitalism will not come about with any one political movement, nor any one new technology. The project here has to be to build a better world, and it needs to be one which pushes and prods at the limits of capitalist social relations in every single way possible. And the tactic of repurposing, I think, is one way which goes beyond simple interruption, and it also goes beyond a sort of folk politics of immediacy and unscalable practices. So I think repurposing tries to build the conditions for a new world now by reorienting the materials at hand. Now I'll sort of conclude with the fact that, reiterating that repurposing, because technology is not neutral, is political, repurposing has to be done on a case-by-case basis. And this is what I want to do over the next 2 weeks, essentially, is to sort of look at these technologies and see whether or not what potentials they do offer for repurposing or not. And I'll leave it at that for today then. So if there's any sorts of questions and stuff, or if we want to have a short break, I don't know.
I was wondering talk more about why, like, de Tournemont and the Situationists worked artistically but not so much practically, or maybe talk more about how urban space didn't really work out, like the idea of the, is it Derive or the psychogeography? Talk a little bit about that, just kind of why they failed.
Yeah. I mean, I'm far from being an expert on situationism, so I don't want to sort of pretend I know too much here. But largely, I think the problem had to do with the sort of, they wanted to produce a particular experience of meaning. They want to produce a particular type of novel meaning that didn't exist already, whether this be through artistic materials or whether it be through sort of urban spaces. And I think the thing is that can be quite useful, but it has to be useful for certain specific ends. And I don't think that those ends are what we need nowadays. I think everybody's quite well aware of the sort of, terrible nature of things, the sort of fact that we're on a completely unsustainable path. So I don't think we need to, really create a sort of widespread meaning and experience that upset our everyday lives. So I think that my sense, and I could be wrong, but my sense of situationism is useful for that, but not so useful for a broader sort of social change, socio-technical change, really. So that's my thought. Let's see, some other questions here. Yeah.
Well, there's
So there's sort of mention of hackers and makers as well, which I find quite interesting. I think it can be sort of powerful force, and I think if you look at the way the open source movement has sort of operated in intellectual properties, things like the music industry most obviously, the effects that it has had on these sorts of things, if that could be translated towards physical products with sort of 3D printing and things like that, I think it could be quite an interesting sort of change within capitalism. I think the one thing that has to be sort of thought about and reflected upon is the fact that these developments are not just going to be sort of calmly accepted into capitalist social relations, that they are going to be resisted at every point, just in the way that, like, pirating music has been at every single point. And I think in the situation of producing physical goods, it's going to be an even harder sort of legal political struggle to get these things done. But I do think there is a lot of potential. If we want to have a sort of world of abundance and a sort of responsiveness as well to individual demand, something like Maker's Movement is quite interesting in that regard. A question from Samuel. Yeah, so what does a post-capitalist technology look like? I mean, for me, it has to do with fundamentally, it's a sort of a matter of fundamental, almost philosophical principles here, which is, I think these things should be used for freedom. And what do I mean by freedom? I mean a very particular idea of it. So it's not the negative idea of freedom, which is very common nowadays. This idea that freedom from the state, freedom to enter into the market, freedom to buy goods in the market, these sorts of things. But it's also not freedom from constraint in the sense of if we just get rid of certain things holding us back, we'll therefore be free. I think freedom is actually intrinsically tied up with constraints. And freedom sort of emerges from properly organized constraints. Now, this means that freedom is something that actually has to be built up. Freedom is something that has to be constructed. It's not something that just emerges once you get rid of other constraints. So this is what sort of the technologies of a post-capitalist world for me would be to build up these different technologies of freedom, which at a basic level are the expansion of possibilities to do things, the expansion of our capacities in a very sort of Spinozistic way of enabling us to do new things. So I mean, just compare what people can do nowadays compared to, say, 100 years ago, and it's quite different. We're massively more improved. Even many of the poorest of us can do things that many people weren't able to do 100 years ago. So technology is the source of a lot of these different capacities, and I think that essentially getting these technologies to A, release us from wage labor, B, release us from scarcity, so a world of abundance and a world of free time. These two basic things are a condition for then starting to think about how we can use these technologies to then expand our capacities and reorient technological development in ways which aren't just about the further valorization of capital, for instance. So that's sort of what I think post-capitalist technologies should be used for. Again, there's the entire political question of how do you actually achieve that. But as a sort of moral and ethical question, that's, I think, what these things should be used for.
So I have a question about the repurposing of some of these technologies. I put a little comment in about Heidegger and his reflection later on in his career about the resemblance of modern industrial agriculture and other processes resembling the sort of killing technologies of the Nazi regime. And is it possible that these technologies have an essence of their own that actually impacts on their use by humans, and as such will inevitably come back to the same point? You mentioned nuclear weapons earlier, and I'm thinking of these Heideggerian issues.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I don't find Heidegger particularly convincing on these things. I think, I mean, the point is he's pitched at such a generic ontological level that I think he misses the sort of ontic empirical aspects of these technologies and the variation involved in them. There's a guy, I'm trying to remember his name now. He's a sort of post-Heideggerian, but he makes this very critique about Heidegger that actually, Heidegger has maybe something to say about industrial technologies, but he doesn't really have anything to say about microelectronics, nanotechnologies, synthetic biology, these sorts of things. And then he sort of, it breaks down at that point. And I think that Heidegger's attempt to find an essence of technology for all technologies, I think just goes wrong, in my opinion. It's also not politically useful. So question, I guess, from Dimitri. If Dimitri, you want to speak up. Can't hear you yet. I can read out your question if you need be. Okay, so let me read out the question here.
Here we go.
Okay. I think we can hear you now. Maybe not. Okay, so I mean, Dimitri's question is essentially this idea of, I imply that sort of platforms suggest a stagist vision of history, and why should that be the case? And does it contradict the sort of case-by-case basis of repurposing? Yeah, okay, so the way I see it is when I talk about the stagist conception of history, it's a very, very broad conception of history, which is to say that one can't jump from, say, an agricultural economy to one simply premised upon post-work society and material abundance as well. And that, in fact, these things, you need to pass through certain stages beforehand. You need to not necessarily pass through an industrialization stage, but you do need to have, some basis for enabling that abundance to come about, which, as far as I moment, can only occur through building up some basic means of manufacturing. So there's a certain sense in which you have to build up the income of people, you have to build up the infrastructure of society, you have to build up particular sort of social relations before you can start talking about a which if we want, there's understood as a post-work, post-abundance world, that it has to have these things in place. That being said, if you look at the actual history of sort of development over past 100 years, one of the biggest issues for developing countries has been, well, how do we develop our economy in the wake of other developed economies? So how does China develop? How does Japan develop? How does Africa develop? And each one of these has had to come to terms with the fact that, well, it's very, very difficult. And importantly for this question, you can't just follow the path set out by European nations. And actually, each of these has had to be quite different in terms of their development. That being said, I think at a broad level, they're still aiming towards building up some sort of manufacturing. Even if it's not the same pathway, they still have to pass a certain stage before they can get to a next stage. So that's sort of what I mean by that it's a minimal stages sort of idea of history. And there's also no necessity to it either. So these are all political struggles. How it turns out, or whether it does or does not turn out, is the result of political struggles rather than being some sort of necessary development of the productive forces. So I don't think that this is sort of a... I don't think it contradicts the case-by-case basis of repurposing, because then it's sort of a different question. We're asking not what do we need for post-capitalism, which is the sort of first question. Instead, we're asking what is available in the present moment that we could use for post-capitalism. So I think they're sort of responding to two different questions. I believe there's a question now from Giancarlo.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, it's not so much a question as an addendum to what you were saying, because I think that the hacker and maker movement sort of does this labor of repurposing of structures really well, especially what I think is in Latin America. I think they do it quite well, because it's the use, well, on the macro level, is the use of old media and old apparatuses that they kind of reuse and repurpose into something, and they kind of, for example, take out the batteries or something, or take out the engine of something, of a previous apparatus, and they sort of make something new. and this kind of thing is explored by this theorist called David Gauntlet, I think, from Making is Connected. He makes the link between craft and making, and making in the technological sense. And yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to add, because the maker movement is, at least in Latin America, they are doing quite a bit of this, at least in a micro scale.
Yeah, no, that sounds excellent. I mean, it's something I need to do some more research into, and I know you and I have talked before about it, and it's quite some interesting things going on. Yeah, I'm very curious to see exactly what is being done, and I think the sort of one of my fundamental questions, and this is sort of Alex and I's critique of folk politics, is that one of the fundamental political questions has to be, well, how do you expand, how do you scale any particular practice? And my concern is that at least the sort of popular vision of makerspaces tends to be that it's a very small thing with not much interest in scaling. Now, I think there's probably very good examples of makerspaces not doing that and actually trying to build bigger movements, and I think that's great. But I think the question has to be expanding and developing these things further. Question from Sam, I believe.
Hey, you got to my question before, Nick, already.
Okay. Do we have any other questions then?
Maybe, Aaron, did you want to pose one?
Even if it's half form, it can be good.
I guess I can try to extrapolate. Oh, I'm getting a bad echo, though. Yeah, I guess what I'm interested in more specifically, and I don't know how much the folk politics book addresses this, but more some of the framework in terms of what kind of structures of collective agency and sort of rational mediation of authority that a critique of folk politics would also have to attack and to bring this kind of thing about.
Yeah, so the sort of, I guess, the political agent of transformation, is that sort of what you're getting at?
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking about the way Peter Wolfendale had used the term folk politics and sort of how that relates to your use of the term.
Okay. How did he use it? I'm curious. I'm not sure.
And I mean, there are posts from a while ago. I was wondering if you were even aware of them or had influenced them. But similar, he compares them also to sort of attacking sort of folk sociology and folk economics. So, I mean, I take that specifically as sort of conceptions of the human being as an actor and decision maker that are kind of based on notions that don't really hold up or aren't scientifically tenable. Oh, I think we lost me.
No, still got you.
Oh, you're still here.
Yeah.
So similar to, I guess, Delanda's sort of transformation of sociology, and the way you're trying to reshape economics to sort of do away with both older Marxist and neoclassical kinds of economics, actually create a transition. So what of that properly for politics would be?
Yeah. So I guess I'll discuss a little bit about what we mean by folk politics in the book. In a very sort of simple way is to say, well, it's a politics of immediacy. And it's a politics which is premised upon three different kinds of immediacy. So there's spatial immediacy. We think about various localisms, things like this. There's temporal immediacy, so sort of politics of interruption or a politics of a temporary autonomous zone. You also have conceptual immediacy, so a preference for particularisms, a preference for sort of affect and experience, as opposed to, say, more abstract and rational things. So this is what sort of folk politics ties itself to. And the problem is that when it ties itself to those things, it then loses the capacity to expand temporally, spatially, and conceptually. And it refuses that gesture of, which I think is a fundamental political gesture of trying to transform the world. And instead it just sort of hopes that these small-scale things will reach some sort of critical mass at some point, and I guess something will happen at that point. So this is what we mean by folk politics, the politics of immediacy, which neglects the problems of scale and expansion. Now, we mean this, to relate this sort of folk psychology, we mean this in the sense that folk psychology is a sort of derogative term used for reliance upon intuitive ideas about psychology, so thinking that we act in terms of beliefs, desires, reasons. And instead, neuroscientists will say, or neurophilosophers will say, well, actually, that's just a sort of, phenomenological product of brain patterns, various brain patterns. And there's a certain sense in which, well, the common experience doesn't actually match up with the real patterns, the real mechanisms. And this is what we mean by folk politics in the sense that people think that folk politics, in the politics of immediacy, works, and this has become a sort of common sense of how you do politics today. It's become the sort of, if there's an issue, this is how we're supposed to respond to it. So it's a common sense that everybody, a lot of people believe in, but it's missing the real questions of power today. It's missing the real mechanisms of power, and it's missing the real mechanisms of producing politics. And so it's sort of a critique in that way, if that sort of clarifies things a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll try to sort of reformulate and sharpen the question as we go along. So.
Yeah.
Hi, my question is, does kind of repurposing a technology create less conflict or resistance than creating a new technology, at least initially?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't thought about that. I think it depends to some degree. I think something in like a marginal space is quite interesting in terms of being able to create new technologies quite freely, and there's not a whole lot of political struggle at the moment, at least, against doing that. At the same time, you can also imagine, so Mariana Mazzucato, for instance, has a book called The Entrepreneurial State, in which she points out that the vast majority of our technological advancements over the past few decades have been the result of state investment. And that actually, if this is the case, maybe we should have democratic control over state investment. And so we can sort of think about, well, if we have control over state investment, we're then choosing which technologies to create. And I think that that's quite an interesting political project in itself. It would be subject, obviously, to a struggle to achieve that, but it is an interesting hypothesis. Repurposing, on the other hand, I think, again, you can imagine quite easy circumstances, something like taking a bench and using it as a barricade in a protest. You can imagine slightly more difficult circumstances, like the Lucas Plan example of trying to take over a factory and transition it to producing completely different goods. And then you can imagine something which I think is probably one of the hardest ones, something like a global logistics system, so there's an argument from Jasper Burns in a collection called Endnotes, which he argues, and it's quite a powerful argument, I think, that logistics can't be repurposed because it would have to be immediately global, and this is the sort of crucial hinge of difficulty, which means that we can't use it, we can't repurpose it. So that's sort of the most difficult situation you can imagine. I don't think he's quite right on that. I think that it doesn't have to be global, but if you accept that, then that would be sort of, we need global revolution to repurpose that system, and then it seems quite difficult. So I don't know if creation can be quite easy, but so can repurposing, and I think they all play out quite differently.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I think we're almost reaching the end at the moment. I think we've got about 10 minutes left. Jason, do you know?
Yeah, well, technically it would be, yeah, anytime between now and the next, 10, 20 minutes.
Okay. Well, are there any final questions?
What about like Jose or somebody who hasn't spoken yet? Tracy or Raul? Just a second, Raul. I think your microphone is low. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks, Nick, for the talk. And I guess I don't really have a question, but more of a pre-existing sort of confusion or general interest in clarifying one aspect of what Marx talks about. In chapter 15, just kind of, I think it's a general concern which weaves throughout Capital, is the idea that with the shifting composition of industry to favor constant capital, that leads to a falling rate of profit, and the sort of imminent contradiction of that shift. And I guess that my own way of kind of working that out is just that there's this point that is reached where the essentially the labor power that is displaced by machines becomes so cheap that it becomes cheaper to employ workers again than it is to use a machine, and that's when it's almost like this reversal of the situation. And so I guess I'm just wondering, maybe you could go into that a little bit. I'm not sure if that's a good way to wrap up the class, but I don't know if you have a more shorthand way of talking about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. It's something we sort of discuss a lot in our book, the Verso book. There's a couple different sort of tendencies here. One is the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, which plays a major role in Volume 3. But if you look at Volume 1, it's interesting because the major capitalist tendency there, and Marx at one point calls it, quote unquote, the absolute general tendency of capitalism, that tendency is to produce surplus populations, is to shed off laborers and workers to the side and produce them as a surplus population. Now those two things intertwine, the sort of tendency for surplus population, tendency for rate of profit to fall. Those things intertwine. I think they also intertwine with the tension that sort of gets pulled out in the fragment on machines, which is that there is this production of abundance, and there is an increasing production by machinery and general intellect, but the measure of value still remains labor, still remains labor time. And I think all these sort of contradictions and these tensions within capitalism do get played out in interesting ways. But to get to your sort of specific point about does labor become cheap enough at some point that machines are then used instead of workers. I think actually this is what you see happening right now in many, many places. So there's this interesting aspect of there's all this noise, for instance, about all these new machines that we have, advances in machine learning, advances in automation. It's going to be a wave of job losses and all of this stuff. The place you would expect to see this stuff occurring in the economic statistics is the productivity levels. But the productivity levels globally have actually slowed down over the past 10 to 15 years. And this has been one of the major economic puzzles that economists have been trying to figure out, is why is productivity declining over the past 15 years? Now you contrast that with all these fancy new technologies that we have, and I think one of the answers why these fancy new technologies haven't led to an increase in productivity statistics is because labor tends to be so cheap at the moment that most companies would rather invest in cheap labor than in machines. So I think this is one answer for the productivity statistics at the moment. The other sort of point to make there is that even reformist sort of goals like raising the minimum wage then becomes a quite crucial political tactic in changing the sort of balance of incentives between investment in a post-work world with machines versus investment in cheap labor. And so I think that we can start to strategically place a minimum wage program in terms of its larger goal that we have. And I think this is the way we should start thinking about these different things. But yeah, it's a very, very interesting question and point. Any other final questions?
If we do have a shorter session, basically it's supposed to be like 2.5 hours per session, but if we have a slightly shorter session, it's okay as long as another one is slightly longer. So I would imagine next time with all the like assignments and things like that, it might be more likely to be a little longer.
Yeah, that's a good point. That sounds good. Well, just sort of wrap up with a lead-in for the next couple weeks. And Tracy has an admin question.
Go ahead, Tracy.
Oh, hi. Sorry, just an admin question. I'm wondering, you said some quotes from Bratton and Benjamin, and I know the long Lenin quote was long, but I'm wondering if you can post those or share those so we can have the citation for them or whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that'd be awesome. Thanks so much.
Okay, I'll do that in the Facebook. So yeah. Okay, any other questions?
I guess I have one question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. First, thanks for the talk. And yeah, I found the Jasper Burns essay in the Endnotes collection interesting, because on the one hand, it seems like he identifies the utility of knowledge that you get from logistic systems, or like logistical planning, what he calls counter-logistics, and yet he wants to kind of extend its utility for this port strike in Oakland, but then take it away from any type of global project. And while I feel like I don't find his argument convincing either. I'm just curious what you or Alex have thought about in terms of if we are to embark upon this project of repurposing, with the idea in mind that it could be done to achieve some type of, I don't know, universality. Are there any tactics or strategies also in mind to kind of stave off capitalist repurposing of anti-capitalist or post-capitalist repurposing of technologies? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a really good question. I think it sort of gets into the broader question of where is the space of struggle today? And I think that given that sort of point of production struggles seem to have lost their efficacy, we need to rethink exactly how do we exert power? How do we get points of leverage over capitalists, over the political system in various ways? And this is what I am hoping to do in the last week, is sort of really tackle this question. I think it plays into the question not only of actually getting towards a repurposed sort of system, but then also maintaining it in the face of sort of harsh environment. So I think that that'll sort of be answered in the final week, or not answered. I don't want to say I have the answers, but I think that the sort of questions surrounding that issue will be a bit clearer at that point. And I sort of want to look at traditional point of production struggles. I want to look at circulation struggles. I want to look at unemployed movement struggles. I want to look at social reproduction struggles, and I want to look at riots as a tactic as well. All of these sorts of things, and sort of see what the limits of each one are, what is possible nowadays, and what isn't possible, particularly on the basis of the emerging conditions of production. So in the wake of automation, in the wake of flexible logistics, all of these sorts of things. Yeah, in a certain sense, the repurposing of ideologies after repurposing the technologies. Yeah. So any final questions? Okay. So next week, I want to talk about this idea of flexible production. And this combines a few recent technological innovations, and it responds, I think, importantly, to a historical problem that the USSR faced, which is that the sort of inability they had for production to respond quickly to changing demand. And you see, Francis Bufford's book is excellent on this sort of a fictionalization of this. But they couldn't respond to changing consumer demand or changing industrial demand or anything. And this became a real problem for the USSR system. I think, though, today we have technologies which are enabling it, though. So we have just-in-time logistics systems, and we have additive manufacturing, which partially eliminates the need to reconfigure production lines for every new product. So this is one of the interesting aspects about 3D printing, is it doesn't just spit out one good. It can spit out multiple different types of goods. And this enables a new sort of flexibility that would have really helped, the sort of communist experiment in the USSR. And what I want to do when I look at these technologies is to look at them in three different ways. So I want to ask, what is the capitalist imperative behind their development? So I want to sort of suggest here that these things are going to occur whether we want to or not. The question is, well, how do we repurpose them and take advantage of them? I also want to ask, what is the historical problem of post-capitalism that they help overcome? So rather than just see additive manufacturing or big data as sort of ahistorical novelties, actually they respond to very, very real problems that previous attempts at post-capitalism have had. And I want to sort of set them within that historical lineage. And then I want to ask the question of, what do they offer for an imagined post-capitalist world? Or what sort of post-capitalist demand do they help fulfill? And something like, decentralized planning fulfills the demand of economic democracy. And so we can sort of see how these things build into our foundational principles, how they actually build a material means for them. So I'll leave aside in the next 2 weeks most of the sort of political questions about how do we get them, and I'm going to leave that to the final week about the space of struggle. What can we do today to really exert pressure on the capitalist system and on the state to get something? So that's what I hope to cover in the next few weeks. And I hope this was enjoyable for everybody for the first week. I had fun. Any final questions? Probably the Facebook group is better, if that's okay with everybody, if nobody has a problem with that. It'll be easier to use the Facebook one. If anybody has a problem, just say so. Oh, okay. So maybe we should use the Google Classroom then to post questions. Assignments and presentations, I'll be sending them out tonight, and people will let me know which presentation you want to do, and I'll try to sort everybody into, you get at least one presentation that you want to do. And yeah, we'll sort it out over the next few days, and I'll let everybody know how it goes. Any other questions? Okay. Jason, if there's nothing else?
Yeah. Thanks so much. See you guys next week.
See you all next week.